In the skies over Nazi Germany during the spring of 1944, a sight appeared that would seal the fate of the Third Reich. American P-51 Mustang fighters, sleek silver birds with distinctive checkered noses and invasion stripes, now accompanied heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. When Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, witnessed these American fighters circling above the German capital for the first time, he reportedly said with resignation, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." But this technological triumph that would help win the air war over Europe wasn't the work of a massive engineering team or a government laboratory. Instead, it was largely championed by one remarkable individual whose vision, persistence, and ultimate sacrifice made it possible for single-engine fighters to reach targets that had been considered impossible just months before. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock Jr., a man who lived multiple extraordinary lives before finding his greatest calling in the midst of World War II. But to understand Hitchcock's achievement, we must first understand the desperate situation facing Allied bombers over Germany in 1943, and how a fighter plane originally dismissed by American military leadership would become the weapon that changed everything. By the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign against Germany was on the verge of collapse. The strategy seemed sound on paper. Heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, flying in tight defensive formations, would strike industrial targets deep inside the Reich with precision bombing in daylight hours. The theory promoted by bomber advocates before the war held that these massive aircraft with their multiple gun positions could defend themselves without fighter escort. The phrase, "the bomber will always get through," had become gospel among American air planners. Reality proved brutally different. German fighter pilots, experienced and ruthless, had developed devastating tactics. They would wait just beyond the range of Allied escort fighters, watching as the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings reached their fuel limits and reluctantly turned back toward England. Then the Luftwaffe would strike with coordinated fury. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s would bore in from head-on, their cannon fire ripping through cockpits and fuel tanks. They targeted the lead aircraft first, disrupting formations and creating chaos. The twin-engine Bf-110s would stand off at a distance, launching unguided rockets into the bomber boxes, hoping to break up the defensive formations. Sometimes they would attack from above, diving through the formations with throttles pushed to their stops, firing and then diving away before the bombers' guns could track them effectively. The statistics tell the grim story. On October 14th, 1943, a day that would become known as Black Thursday, the 8th, Air Force launched 291 bombers against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. These factories were critical to German war production, producing components essential for everything from tanks to aircraft. The planners believed that destroying them would cripple German industry. The mission was a catastrophe. 60 bombers failed to return. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. More than 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. This represented a loss rate of over 26%, utterly unsustainable by any military standard. The odds of a B-17 crew member surviving the required 25 missions to complete a tour of duty were 1 in 4. Entire squadrons could be decimated in a single afternoon, their neat formations dissolving into scattered debris falling from 25,000 feet. The human cost was staggering, and the strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to cripple German industry was instead bleeding the American Air Force white. Young men, many barely out of their teens, climbed into their aircraft knowing that statistics suggested they would not survive their tour. The cold at altitude was brutal, the missions lasting hours, and the terror of watching nearby aircraft explode or spin down in flames was constant. Frostbite, oxygen deprivation, and battle fatigue plagued crews. The United States air operations in Europe would eventually suffer more fatalities than the entire Marine Corps endured in its protracted, bloody campaign across the Pacific Islands. The fundamental problem was range. American fighters simply couldn't go the distance. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a formidable aircraft nicknamed the Jug by its pilots. It was tough as nails, heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns, and could absorb tremendous punishment. But its thirsty radial engine limited its range even with drop tanks. At best, with external tanks, it could reach targets about 300 miles from its base. This was enough to cover raids into France and the western parts of Germany, but not the deep penetrations into the industrial heartland that strategic planners demanded. The twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning had better range, and its twin Allison engines gave it good performance at altitude. But the Lightning suffered from other issues, including high-altitude engine problems that plagued operations in the European theatre's cold conditions, and the aircraft was always in short supply, with production diverted to North Africa and the Pacific. What the 8th Air Force desperately needed was a fighter that could match the performance of German interceptors at high altitude, possess the maneuverability to win dogfights, and still have the range to accompany bombers to Berlin, over 1,100 miles from bases in England, and return home. Most aviation experts believed such an aircraft was impossible to build. The laws of physics seemed immutable. You could have range or performance, but not both. Fuel was heavy, taking up space that could otherwise be used for engines, weapons, or structural strength. But that aircraft already existed. It was called the P-51 Mustang, and in the summer of 1943, it was being largely ignored by American military planners, its potential unrecognized by the very people who needed it most. The Mustang's origins were unconventional from the start. In April 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation in California with a request: build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license for the Royal Air Force. The RAF desperately needed modern fighters to replace losses from the Battle of Britain, and American production capacity could help fill that need. The P-40 was an adequate aircraft, but already showing its age, a product of late 1930s design thinking. But North American's president, James Kindleberger, a man known as Dutch to his colleagues, made a counter-proposal that was either brilliant or audacious, depending on one's perspective. Rather than build another company's outdated design, North American would design and produce an entirely new fighter that would be superior to the P-40 in every measurable way. The British were sceptical but intrigued. They asked how long this would take. Kindleberger promised a prototype in 120 days. The lead engineer for this ambitious project was Edgar Schmude, a self-taught German immigrant with an extraordinary talent for aircraft design. Schmude had fled Germany in 1925, 7 years after World War I had devastated the German economy, and left his homeland in ruins. Working first in Brazil for General Motors, then for Fokker Aircraft in New Jersey, and finally for North American Aviation in California, Schmude had been waiting for an opportunity like this. He had studied aircraft design obsessively, learning from European innovations and American production techniques. When Kindleberger asked him whether they should build P-40s under license, Schmude's response was immediate and confident. "Well, Dutch, don't let us build an obsolete airplane. Let's build a new one. We can design and build a better one." What Schmude and his team created in a remarkably short time was unlike any fighter before it. The NA-73X, as the prototype was designated, incorporated cutting-edge aerodynamic features that represented the state of the art in 1940. Most notably, it used a laminar flow wing, a relatively symmetrical airfoil design that offered dramatically reduced drag at high speeds. This was revolutionary technology, developed with data from the National Advisory Committee for Aviation, the precursor to NASA. The wing design wasn't just about speed. It was also structurally efficient, built with only 2 main spars running through it, making it easier to manufacture while providing ample space for fuel tanks between the spars. Traditional wings required more complex internal bracing that took up valuable space. Schmude's team also designed an innovative cooling system for the aircraft's liquid-cooled engine. Rather than treating the radiator as a necessary drag penalty, something to be hidden away and minimized, they positioned it in a ventral scoop beneath the fuselage and designed it to take advantage of what was known as the Meredith effect. Air entering the scoop would be heated by the radiator, and the expanding hot air could be directed out through a controlled exit, generating a small amount of thrust that partially offset the drag created by the cooling system itself. It was an elegant solution that turned a liability into a near-neutral feature. The result was an aircraft that looked fast even sitting on the ground, with smooth contours and clean lines that seemed to promise exceptional performance. The prototype was rolled out just 102 days after the contract was signed, beating even Kindleberger's optimistic promise. It first flew on October 26, 1940, with test pilot Vance Breeze at the controls. Breeze found the aircraft handled beautifully, responding crisply to control inputs, and exhibiting none of the nasty habits that plagued some contemporary designs. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent, the aircraft was stable in all flight regimes, and it could accommodate an impressive fuel load. The British were pleased and placed production orders. The RAF designated it the Mustang Mark I, giving the aircraft the name by which it would become legendary. By the spring of 1942, RAF Mustang squadrons were conducting combat operations over occupied Europe. There was just one problem, and it was a significant one that seemed to condemn the Mustang to secondary roles. The Allison V1710 engine that powered these early Mustangs was a capable power plant at low and medium altitudes. It was reliable, produced good power, and was in abundant supply. But it lacked an efficient high-altitude supercharger. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang's performance fell off dramatically as the Allison engine gasped for air in the thin atmosphere. Since the heavy bombers flew their missions at 25,000 feet or higher to avoid flak, and German interceptors operated effectively at those altitudes, the Mustang seemed unsuited for the escort role. The RAF used their Mustangs for low-level tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions, roles where their speed and range at low altitude were valuable assets. The aircraft would scream over the French countryside at treetop level, photographing German installations and strafing targets of opportunity. But they couldn't be sent up to challenge Messerschmitts at bomber altitudes. The US Army Air Force showed little interest in the type, seeing it as a British aircraft of limited utility, something designed for someone else's requirements. This is where our story truly begins, because one man recognised what nearly everyone else had missed. That man was Thomas Hitchcock Jr., and his journey to this moment of recognition was as improbable as the aircraft he would champion. Born into privilege in 1900, Tommy Hitchcock seemed destined for a life of leisure and social prominence. His father was a Racing Hall of Fame horse trainer and founding figure of polo in America, having helped establish the Meadowbrook Polo Club on Long Island, and captained the American team in the inaugural 1886 International Polo Cup. His mother, known as the Mother of American Polo, was an ardent horsewoman who would coach players, including her famous son, until her death in 1934 from injuries suffered in a fall from a horse at age 67. Young Tommy grew up in this world of wealth and sport, attending elite schools like St. Paul's and later Harvard. But beneath the privileged exterior burned a fierce competitive spirit and a passion for aviation that would define his life. At 17, deemed too young by the US Army to fly, Hitchcock made a decision that revealed his character. Rather than wait, he joined the French Lafayette Flying Corps during World War I. The Lafayette Flying Corps was an organisation that allowed American volunteers to fly for France before the United States entered the war. Hitchcock travelled to France, learned to fly French aircraft, and earned his wings with the French Air Service. He scored 3 aerial victories before being shot down and captured by the Germans in 1918. After 6 months as a prisoner of war, being transferred between camps, Hitchcock saw his opportunity. He stole a map from a guard, jumped from a moving train while being transported between facilities, and walked nearly 100 miles through hostile territory to the safety of neutral Switzerland. He was 18 years old, alone in enemy territory, nursing injuries from his capture, but he never considered giving up. It was this combination of daring and determination that would characterize everything he did. After the war, Hitchcock returned to America and became one of the country's most famous polo players. From 1922 to 1940, he maintained a 10-goal handicap, the highest ranking possible in the sport, a rating held by only a handful of players at any given time. He led 4 teams to US National Open Championships. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who counted Hitchcock among his friends and polo teammates, used him as loose inspiration for characters in both The Great Gatsby and Tender is the Night. Fitzgerald once said Hitchcock was high in his pantheon of heroes. Hitchcock also became a successful investment banker at Lehman Brothers, married Margaret Mellon, grandniece of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, and lived the life of a wealthy socialite. To outward appearances, he was the epitome of the American aristocrat, comfortable and accomplished in every sphere. But when America entered World War II following Pearl Harbor, the 41-year-old Hitchcock wanted only one thing: to fly fighters again. He immediately volunteered, ready to leave his comfortable life and return to combat. General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, personally turned him down, citing his age. 41 was far too old for fighter operations, Arnold explained. The physical demands were too great, the reflexes too important. Hitchcock was persistent, as he had always been. He understood bureaucracy well enough to know that a direct approach had failed, so he needed to find another path. He leveraged his connections, reaching out to old friend John Gilbert Wynant, who was serving as US ambassador to Great Britain, having replaced the controversial Joseph Kennedy in that role. Wynant suggested a compromise. Hitchcock could come to London as an assistant air attaché to the US Embassy. The position would give him a role in the air war, though not a fighter cockpit. It wasn't what Hitchcock wanted, but it was a way into the war, a chance to contribute. Hitchcock accepted immediately, arriving in London in 1942. It was during this posting in London that Hitchcock made a visit to RAF Duxford, a development facility where the British were testing new aircraft and modifications. Britain had become the world's laboratory for air combat, testing everything under actual combat conditions. If an idea worked at Duxford, it would work anywhere. There, Hitchcock learned about a promising American fighter that had been built exclusively for the RAF, the P-51 Mustang. More importantly, he learned about an experiment the British were conducting that would change the entire trajectory of the air war. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, had flown a standard Allison-engine Mustang at Duxford and been impressed by everything except its high-altitude performance. The aircraft handled superbly, was fast at low altitude, had good range, and possessed excellent visibility for the pilot. But above 15,000 feet, it simply couldn't compete. Harker immediately recognised that the solution was obvious: mate the Mustang's exceptional airframe with Britain's finest engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin was legendary, a masterpiece of engineering that had powered the Supermarine Spitfire to victory in the Battle of Britain. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, designed by Stanley Hooker of Rolls-Royce, gave it exceptional high-altitude performance. The first stage compressed the incoming air, and the second stage compressed it again, forcing enough air into the cylinders to maintain power even in the thin air above 25,000 feet. The British quickly modified 5 Mustangs with Merlin engines for testing. The results were nothing short of astounding, exceeding even the optimistic predictions. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, almost 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at that altitude. The aircraft's performance didn't just improve. Incrementally, it was transformed completely. Here, finally, was a fighter that combined high-altitude performance matching or exceeding the best German fighters, excellent maneuverability in dogfights, and the Mustang's inherent long range thanks to those fuel tanks in the laminar flow wings. Hitchcock grasped the implications immediately, with the clarity that came from his experience as both a World War I fighter pilot and a strategic thinker. This aircraft could change the entire strategic situation over Europe. It could escort the bombers all the way to their targets and back, eliminating the deadly gap that German fighters exploited. The Mustang, powered by a British engine that was already being produced under license in America by the Packard Motor Company, could be the plane the bomber offensive desperately needed. Hitchcock had found his mission, and he pursued it with the same fierce determination that had driven him to escape from a German prison camp 25 years earlier. In fall 1942, Hitchcock prepared a detailed report for Washington, recommending the immediate development of the Merlin-powered Mustang as a high-altitude escort fighter. He included performance data from the British tests, tactical analysis of how the aircraft would be employed, and production estimates. He also made a bold prediction that the Merlin Mustang would be the best fighter of 1943. But selling this idea to Army Air Force leadership proved frustratingly difficult. There were multiple obstacles, some technical, others bureaucratic, and still others rooted in pride and politics that had nothing to do with winning the war. First, there was institutional bias. The Mustang had been designed for the British, not the US military. It wasn't developed through normal Army Air Force channels, didn't emerge from Wright Field or any American military facility. Some leaders seemed to view it with suspicion for that reason alone, as if its foreign origins somehow tainted it. Second, adopting a British engine for an American fighter seemed to carry implications about American technological capability that made some officers uncomfortable. Were American engines inferior? Would this admission damage morale or industrial pride? These concerns, petty in retrospect, carried real weight in 1942. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the Army Air Force had already pinned its hopes for a long-range escort on a different aircraft, the General Motors P-75 Eagle, which was being developed specifically for that role through proper channels with appropriate oversight. Abandoning that program in favour of a British modification of a British-ordered aircraft would represent a substantial embarrassment. Hitchcock refused to give up. He understood that institutional inertia and bureaucratic channels could kill a vital program through delay and indifference as surely as enemy action. Good ideas could die in committee rooms while men died in the skies over Germany. His response was to bypass those channels entirely, using every tool and connection at his disposal. He hosted parties and dinners in London, bringing together influential figures and making his case for the Mustang. He flooded Washington with performance data from the British tests. He used every connection he had made in business, sports and society, calling in favours and twisting arms. One colleague later wrote that Hitchcock seemed unable to hear the word no, and that channels like red tape were something he didn't recognise. He was a man on a mission, convinced that thousands of lives depended on his success. In November 1942, Hitchcock flew to Washington for a crucial meeting. He called on Robert Lovett, an old friend from World War I who was now serving as Under-Secretary of War. Both men had been pilots in the previous war. Both understood what was at stake over Germany in ways that desk officers could not. Lovett listened to Hitchcock's passionate advocacy and examined the data from the British tests. The numbers were compelling, the logic was sound, and the need was desperate. Then Lovett took the case to General Arnold himself. The timing was fortuitous. The disaster of Schweinfurt was approaching, and the unsustainable losses in the bomber offensive were becoming impossible to ignore. Moreover, a fighter pilot at Wright Field had test-flown the P-75 Eagle, the aircraft that was supposed to solve the escort problem. His assessment was damning. The P-75 was big, clumsy and unstable. Even if it had the range, it couldn't defend itself, much less protect bombers. The supposed solution to the long-range escort problem was a failure, and everyone was beginning to realise it. Arnold, to his credit, made the decision quickly once convinced. In August 1942, even before the first American prototype flew in November, the Army Air Force placed an order for 2,200 Merlin-powered Mustangs. It was an enormous commitment, a vote of confidence in an unproven modification of an aircraft the service had previously shown little interest in. North American aviation geared up for massive production, with P-51Bs rolling off assembly lines in both Inglewood, California, and a new plant in Dallas, Texas. But Hitchcock's work wasn't finished. The Merlin engine had solved the altitude problem, transforming the Mustang's high-altitude performance, but the range equation still needed work. This is where another crucial innovation came into play, one that would be as important as the engine change itself. The original P-51B had fuel tanks in the wings holding 184 gallons total. This was good, significantly better than the P-47's internal capacity, but not enough for deep penetration missions into Germany. Drop tanks could extend range significantly, but they had their own issues. Early drop tank designs were problematic. The weight of fuel in the wing-mounted tanks could destabilize the aircraft in dives, causing dangerous control issues. Moreover, drop tanks had to be jettisoned when enemy fighters appeared, and once dropped, that fuel was gone. The aircraft was then limited to its internal fuel for the combat and return flight. In July 1943, the Army Air Force directed fighter manufacturers to maximize internal fuel capacity. North American Aviation's engineers calculated that the P-51B's center of gravity was forward enough to allow installation of an additional fuel tank in the fuselage behind the pilot's seat. This wasn't a small modification requiring minor adjustments. The new tank held 85 gallons, increasing total internal fuel from 184 to 269 gallons, a 30% increase that translated directly into range. Combined with improved external drop tanks holding 108 gallons each, the P-51 now had unprecedented range for a single-engine fighter. The numbers were staggering. Over 1,600 miles operational range, enough to reach any target in Germany and return to England. The engineering challenge wasn't just about fitting the tank into available space, though that was no small feat given the aircraft's compact design. The bigger issue was centre of gravity and aircraft stability. Fuel weighs about 6 pounds per gallon, so 85 gallons added over 500 pounds behind the pilot. This weight affected the aircraft's balance and handling characteristics in fundamental ways. With the fuselage tank full, the P-51 became longitudinally unstable, meaning the aircraft wanted to pitch nose up or nose down rather than maintaining level flight. Pilots were warned that with a full fuselage tank, violent pullouts or tight turns could cause the stick loads to rapidly reverse, leading to snap rolls or loss of control. The aircraft could literally flip over if mishandled with a full rear tank. The solution to this handling problem was procedural rather than technical, requiring discipline and training rather than more engineering. Pilots were instructed to burn fuel from the fuselage tank first, during the cruise out to enemy territory, before any combat was expected. By the time they reached areas where they might encounter German fighters, the fuselage tank would be nearly empty or at least below 40 gallons, restoring normal handling. Then they would switch to the drop tanks, which would be jettisoned when combat began. Finally, they would rely on the wing tanks for combat maneuvering and the flight home. This fuel management discipline was critical and had to become second nature for every Mustang pilot. Mistakes could be fatal. The development of suitable drop tanks was equally important to the range equation. Early metal drop tanks were heavy, expensive, and in short supply. A breakthrough came with the development of papier-mâché drop tanks. These were lighter, cheaper, and completely disposable. They wouldn't work as improvised bombs if jettisoned over targets, but they worked fantastically well for their intended purpose of carrying fuel. With 108-gallon paper drop tanks, P-51s could fly more than 600 miles on the tanks alone, then still have all their internal fuel for combat and the return flight. This innovation, simple though it may sound, was transformative. The paper tanks could be manufactured quickly in large quantities, solving supply problems that had plagued earlier external tank programs. By late 1943, all the pieces were in place. The Merlin engine provided high-altitude performance that matched or exceeded German fighters. The fuselage tank and improved drop tanks provided unprecedented range. The laminar flow wing gave the Mustang excellent speed and fuel efficiency. The result was an aircraft that could escort bombers to Berlin, 100 miles from bases in England, engage in air combat with the Luftwaffe's best fighters, and return home. It was the plane that experts had said was impossible, the solution that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The first unit to receive the P-51B in Europe was the 354th Fighter Group, which got their aircraft in November 1943. Although officially part of the tactical 9th Air Force, they were immediately co-opted by the 8th Air Force for strategic escort missions. The 8th needed them desperately and wasn't going to let organisational charts prevent their use. Their first combat mission, a fighter sweep over France, came on December 1st, 1943. Then came the escort missions, to Amiens, to Emden, to Kiel, each one pushing deeper into German territory. The mission to Kiel on December 13th was particularly important, reaching 480 miles into Germany and finally forcing the Luftwaffe to respond in force. The Germans couldn't ignore Allied bombers, striking that deep into the Reich. The 4th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Donald Blakesley, received their P-51s on February 28, 1944. Blakesley was a former RAF Eagle Squadron pilot who had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts and made no secret of his preference for more nimble fighters. His pilots got their Mustangs ready for operations in less than a day, an almost unprecedented turnaround. Some took off with less than an hour's checkout time in the new aircraft, learning on the job in a way that would horrify modern safety officers, but reflected the desperate urgency of the situation. 4 days later, on March 4th, 1944, they escorted B-17s and B-24s to Berlin. It was the first time single-engine fighters had made the 100-mile trip. The following day, they escorted Liberators almost to Spain, and the day after that they were again over Berlin, shooting down 17 enemy planes that tried to intercept the bombers. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking bombers with near impunity, once the short-range escorts turned back, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin was shocking and demoralizing. These American fighters weren't supposed to be here, hundreds of miles deep in German territory. The fuel calculations said it was impossible, but they were, and they were eager for combat, diving into German formations with their 650 caliber machine guns blazing. On March 6, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group shot down 20 enemy aircraft without a single loss. The The tide of the air war was turning decisively. Throughout March and into April 1944, Mustang groups were escorting bombers deep into Germany on an almost daily basis when weather permitted. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition in a way that would prove irreversible. During Big Week in February 1944, a concentrated bombing offensive against German aircraft production facilities, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. These weren't just statistics. They were the veterans who had survived years of combat, the experts who trained new pilots, the backbone of German fighter defense. Replacing aircraft was difficult but possible. Replacing these experienced pilots was impossible. Germany simply didn't have the training infrastructure or fuel reserves to produce new pilots with equivalent skills. By early 1944, Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and implemented a policy change that would fully utilize the Mustang's capabilities. Previously, fighter escorts were required to stay in close formation with the bombers, essentially flying as defensive screens. Doolittle released most fighters from this requirement, allowing them free rein to attack the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The goal was air supremacy, not just bomber protection. Mustang groups were sent far ahead of the bombers in fighter sweeps to intercept German fighters before they could organize attacks on the bomber stream. Bomber crews complained at first, feeling abandoned, but by June, air supremacy was achieved. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest control of German airspace. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed the Gefechtsverbund, or battle formation, which consisted of a Sturmgruppe of heavily armed and armoured FW 190As, escorted by 2 Begleitgruppen of Bf-109s, whose task was to keep the Mustangs away from the Fabjorn 90s as they attacked the bombers. But this strategy proved problematic. The large German formations took a long time to assemble, were difficult to manoeuvre, and were vulnerable to the aggressive American tactics. Beginning in late February 1944, 8th Air Force fighter units began systematic strafing attacks on German airfields, with increasing frequency and intensity. The objective was to destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground, eliminating aircraft before they could even take off. These missions were extremely dangerous, requiring low-level runs through intense flak, but they were devastatingly effective. Hitchcock, now serving as Deputy Chief of Staff of the 9th Air Support Command in charge of tactical research and development, watched the success of the aircraft he had championed with satisfaction. But the Mustang still had problems to solve. Several aircraft had crashed for no apparent reason during 1944. The mystery was troubling, and loss reports suggested it might be related to the external drop tanks. Perhaps the weight distribution or aerodynamic effects were causing some subtle instability that led to unrecoverable dives. Some pilots reported strange handling characteristics at certain fuel loads. As head of research and development, Hitchcock felt personal responsibility for solving this problem. Rather than delegate the dangerous work of test flying to subordinates, he insisted on investigating himself. It was consistent with his character, direct, hands-on, unwilling to ask others to take risks he wouldn't take himself. In early April 1944, he took up a test Mustang multiple times, systematically testing its behaviour with various fuel loads and configurations, trying to identify what was causing these mysterious crashes. On April 18, 1944, a clear morning at Salisbury, England, Hitchcock climbed into a P-51 Mustang for what would be his final flight. He took the aircraft up to 15,000 feet to test its behaviour with full drop tanks and various flight regimes. Observers on the ground watched the Mustang at altitude, conducting what appeared to be normal test manoeuvres. Then, suddenly and without warning, it hurtled downward in a steep dive, faster and faster. Hitchcock may have been testing the exact condition that other pilots had reported, deliberately putting the aircraft into the configuration that caused problems, or he may have encountered the instability unexpectedly. Either way, the Mustang didn't pull out. It accelerated toward the ground at terminal velocity and smashed into the earth near Salisbury, sending up a plume of black smoke visible for miles. Thomas Hitchcock was killed instantly. He was 44 years old. The irony was crushing. Hitchcock had fought to give the Mustang a chance, had overcome institutional resistance and bureaucratic inertia, had championed the aircraft when others dismissed it, and had lived to see it achieve what he had always known it could achieve. Mustangs were flying over Berlin. The air war was being won. American bombers were striking with increasing impunity deep into Germany, but he died testing the very aircraft whose success he had made possible, trying to make it even better, even safer for the pilots who flew it. Ambassador Wynant, the man who had found a way to bring Hitchcock into the war effort despite his age, wrote to Hitchcock's widow shortly after the crash. The Mustang, Wynant wrote, was tangible evidence of Tommy's contribution to victory. Without it, he said, we would not be winning the air war over Germany. By the time of Hitchcock's death in April 1944, his prediction had been proven absolutely correct. The Mustang wasn't just one of the best fighters of 1943, it was becoming the dominant Allied fighter of the entire war. The impact of the P-51 on the outcome of the war cannot be overstated. By providing long-range escort, it made the strategic bombing campaign viable. The crippling losses that bombers had suffered were dramatically reduced. In October 1943, 9.1% of 8th Air Force bomber sorties credited with attacking their targets had failed to return, with another 45.6% damaged. By February 1944, these figures fell to 3.5% and 29.9% respectively. This was still a terrible toll, but it was sustainable in a way the earlier losses were not. It forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition it couldn't win, bleeding experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft. By D-Day in June 1944, just 2 months after Hitchcock's death, the Luftwaffe had been so weakened that only 2 German aircraft responded to the largest amphibious invasion in history. The Allied air superiority that made the Normandy invasion possible was achieved largely by Mustang pilots systematically destroying German fighters in the air and on the ground. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups were flying Mustangs. Only the 56th Fighter Group retained their P-47s, probably more out of pride than tactical necessity, having established a marvellous combat record with the Thunderbolt. The aircraft dominated air combat in Europe, with American Mustang units claiming nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. The 392nd Fighter Group, the famous Tuskegee Airmen known as the Red Tails, flew Mustangs on escort missions from Italy, establishing an outstanding combat record. The Tuskegee Airmen were roughly 1,000 African-American military pilots trained between 1941 and 1946 at a segregated airbase in Tuskegee, Alabama. The 322nd Fighter Group, consisting of 4 squadrons, flew escort missions for the 15th Air Force based in Italy. When they began receiving P-51 Mustangs in July 1944, they painted the tails red for identification, earning their famous nickname. The Red Tails flew 179 bomber escort missions and developed an exceptional reputation for protecting their charges. While they lost 27 bombers to enemy fighters, this was significantly better than other P-51 groups in the 15th Air Force during the same period. The 302nd Fighter Group shot down 111 enemy aircraft and destroyed another 150 on the ground, proving conclusively that African-American pilots were every bit as capable as their white counterparts, though this should never have been in question. Their success helped pave the way for the integration of the US military after the war. The Mustang served with distinction in the Pacific theatre as well, though it arrived later than in Europe. When the B-29 Super Fortress bombing campaign against Japan began from bases in the Mariana Islands in late 1944, the bombers initially flew unescorted. The distances were simply too great for any existing fighter. But after the capture of Iwo Jima in February 1945, the 7 Fighter Command established P-51 squadrons on that volcanic island, positioned roughly halfway between the Marianas and Japan. From Iwo Jima, Mustangs could escort B-29s all the way to Tokyo and back, a round trip of over 1,500 miles. The first escort mission to Japan took place on April 7, 1945. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots was similar to what the Luftwaffe had experienced. American fighters appearing over the homeland was devastating to morale and combat effectiveness. The total impact of the P-51 Mustang on World War II can be measured in multiple ways. Between 1943 and 1945, the 8th Air Force alone claimed destruction of over 6,000 enemy aircraft, with P-51s accounting for roughly half that total, despite arriving relatively late in the war. The transition from unsustainable losses to air superiority happened remarkably quickly, once Mustangs arrived in numbers. But perhaps the most significant impact was strategic rather than tactical. The Mustang made it possible to carry out the combined bomber offensive as planned, systematically destroying German industrial capacity and oil production. By 1945, the German war economy was in ruins, starved of fuel and raw materials. Panzer divisions sat idle for lack of gasoline. The Luftwaffe couldn't train new pilots adequately because fuel shortages limited flight hours. All of this resulted from the strategic bombing campaign that the Mustang made possible. The story of how one engineer made Mustangs fly Berlin missions non-stop is ultimately a story about multiple engineers, designers, and innovators whose work came together at a critical moment. Edgar Schmood designed an exceptional airframe with unprecedented aerodynamic efficiency. Ronald Harker and the Rolls-Royce team recognized that the Merlin engine could transform that airframe's capabilities. Engineers at Wright Field and North American Aviation solved the fuel capacity challenges that gave the aircraft its remarkable range. Test pilots risked their lives proving the aircraft's capabilities and identifying its limitations. Production workers built over 15,000 Mustangs in less than 3 years, an achievement of industrial mobilization that matched the aircraft's technical excellence. But without Thomas Hitchcock, it's entirely possible that all of this brilliance would have languished unused while American bomber crews died over Germany. The institutional resistance to the Mustang was real and significant. The Army Air Force had invested heavily in other programs and had its own ideas about what was needed. Bureaucracies resist change, especially change that comes from outside normal channels. The Mustang was a British purchase of an American aircraft using a British engine, none of which fit neatly into American procurement processes or strategic planning. It would have been easy for the program to be delayed, underfunded, or relegated to secondary roles, while the supposed purpose-built solution, the P-75, continued to absorb resources despite its failures. Hitchcock's contribution was seeing what was needed, understanding what was possible, and then making it happen through sheer force of will and strategic use of connections. He bypassed normal channels because normal channels were failing. He leveraged personal relationships because institutional relationships were inadequate. He persisted in the face of rejection because he understood that lives hung in the balance. This wasn't just advocacy. It was a campaign fought with the same intensity that he had brought to escaping from German captivity in World War I, or to achieving a 10-goal polo handicap. The nature of Hitchcock's final test flight has never been fully explained. The official accident report cited cause unknown, which was frustratingly common for crashes in that era. Modern analysis suggests several possibilities. The instability issues with full fuselage tanks were real and documented. Hitchcock may have been deliberately testing the aircraft at the edge of its flight envelope, trying to reproduce the conditions that had caused earlier crashes. Or he may have suffered a structural failure, perhaps flutter or loss of a control surface at high speed. The P-51 was still a relatively new aircraft in early 1944, and all the kinks hadn't been worked out. Some early B and C models did experience tail failures during high-speed dives. What is certain is that Hitchcock died doing what he believed was necessary to make the Mustang safer and more effective. He could have delegated the dangerous test work. He could have remained in an administrative role, safe in an office, taking credit for the success he had championed. Instead, at 44 years old, he climbed into a fighter and pushed it to its limits, accepting the same risks that 19 and 20-year-old pilots accepted every day. It was entirely consistent with his character, but it meant his contributions would be largely forgotten by later generations who celebrated the Mustang without knowing the full story of how it came to dominate the skies over Europe. The bomber crews knew, though. They understood better than anyone what the appearance of Mustangs meant for their survival. Before the Mustangs arrived, climbing into a B-17 or B-24 for a mission deep into Germany was like participating in a grim lottery where the odds were terrible and getting worse. Afterward, while the missions were still dangerous and men still died, the psychological burden was dramatically reduced. The sight of those sleek silver fighters, often with brightly painted noses and tails for identification, appearing at the rendezvous point became routine. The bomber crews gave the Mustangs their nickname, Little Friends. Those two words, simple and heartfelt, captured everything: the relief, the confidence, the gratitude. By war's end, the P-51 Mustang had achieved a status that few weapon systems ever attain. It was simultaneously beautiful and deadly, elegant and effective. It looked like what a fighter plane should look like, all smooth curves and purposeful lines. It performed like a fighter should perform, fast and maneuverable and lethal, and it achieved what it was designed to achieve, protecting bombers and destroying enemy aircraft with ruthless efficiency. More than 15,000 were built during the war. Production continued after 1945, with the aircraft serving in conflicts from Korea to the 1960s in various air forces around the world. The Korean War proved the Mustang's continued relevance. While jet aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 fought for air superiority, P-51s served extensively in ground attack and close air support roles. They could carry significant weapon loads, had excellent endurance, and were far cheaper to operate than jets. The Mustang's ability to operate from primitive airstrips and its relative simplicity made it ideal for the conditions in Korea, but Korea also marked the end of the propeller-driven fighter era. The future belonged to jets, and the Mustang's combat career with frontline US forces effectively ended with the Korean armistice in 1953. However, the Mustang's operational life continued for decades in other air forces. Israel operated Mustangs during its War of Independence in 1948, using them as both fighters and makeshift bombers. The Dominican Republic flew P-51s until 1984, making them among the last military operators of the type. Various air forces in Asia, Latin America and Africa used Mustangs well into the 1980s for counterinsurgency and training roles. The aircraft's robust construction and relatively simple maintenance requirements made it attractive for countries that couldn't afford or support more modern jets. Today, more than 100 vintage Mustangs still fly, lovingly restored and maintained by enthusiasts and collectors who appreciate not just the aircraft's beauty and performance, but what it represented: the perfect fusion of engineering excellence and strategic necessity at a critical moment in history. These flying Mustangs appear at air shows around the world, their distinctive Merlin engine sound instantly recognizable to aviation enthusiasts. That sound, a deep, powerful roar that transitions to a crackling howl at high speed, is the sound that bomber crews heard with relief over the skies of Germany 80 years ago. The Mustang's place in popular culture has grown over the decades. It appears in countless films, books, and documentaries about World War II. Scale models of P-51s have been built by millions of hobbyists. The aircraft has become iconic, a symbol not just of American air power but of the Allied victory in World War II. Its distinctive profile is instantly recognizable, even to people with little interest in aviation. This cultural status is unusual for a weapon of war, but the Mustang seems to transcend its military purpose, appreciated as much for its aesthetic qualities as its combat record. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to both the aircraft and the man who championed it came from those bomber crews of the 8th Air Force. They were the ones who watched friends die in burning aircraft as German fighters tore apart their formations. They were the ones who understood, viscerally and immediately, what the appearance of Mustangs meant for their chances of survival. When those sleek fighters appeared at the rendezvous point, shepherding them through hostile skies, the relief was overwhelming. The bomber crews called them their little friends, and those words captured something profound about the relationship between the escorts and the escorted. Thomas Hitchcock Jr. never heard bomber crews use that term. He died in April 1944, and while the phrase was already beginning to circulate, it didn't become universal until later that year. But every time a bomber crew used those words, every time they watched Mustangs circle protectively around the formation, every time they made it home safely because those little friends drove off German interceptors, they were benefiting from decisions Hitchcock made and battles he fought. The Silver Fighters over Berlin were his legacy in the most literal sense. Without his advocacy, his persistence, his refusal to accept institutional inertia, those aircraft might have arrived too late, or in insufficient numbers, or not at all. The question of what might have happened without the Mustang is sobering to contemplate. The strategic bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse in fall 1943. Losses were unsustainable, and there was serious discussion of curtailing or abandoning daylight precision bombing in favour of British-style night area bombing. This would have meant abandoning the careful targeting of industrial facilities in favour of destroying German cities and civilian morale, a strategy that remains controversial to this day. It also would have been less effective at actually destroying German war production. The combined bomber offensive, with its systematic destruction of ball-bearing factories, oil refineries and aircraft plants, did enormous damage to the German war economy. That campaign required daylight precision bombing, which required long-range fighter escorts, which meant Mustangs. Without effective fighter escort, the Allies would have faced a terrible dilemma. They could accept unsustainable losses and continue the campaign, bleeding the bomber force white in a grim arithmetic of attrition. They could switch to night bombing, abandoning precision and accepting civilian casualties while achieving less strategic effect. Or they could delay the bombing campaign until other solutions emerged, giving Germany more time to recover, fortify and prepare defences. None of these alternatives were attractive. The Mustang provided a fourth option: continue and intensify the daylight bombing campaign with acceptable losses, systematically destroying German industrial capacity while achieving air superiority. The impact on the war's timeline and outcome is difficult to quantify precisely, but it was certainly significant. Air superiority made D-Day possible. The systematic destruction of German oil production crippled Wehrmacht mobility. The bombing of aircraft factories limited Luftwaffe strength. All of these effects accelerated Germany's defeat. Historians have debated whether the strategic bombing campaign shortened the war by months or years, but there's little doubt that it had a major impact, and the bombing campaign as actually executed, with its mix of precision strikes and air superiority battles, depended fundamentally on the P-51 Mustang's unique combination of range and performance. So when we ask how one engineer made Mustangs fly Berlin missions non-stop, we're really asking how vision, persistence, and sacrifice combined to turn technological potential into strategic reality. Edgar Schmude and his team at North American Aviation created the potential with their brilliant airframe design. Ronald Harker and the Rolls-Royce engineers recognized how to unlock that potential with the Merlin engine. Wright Field Engineers and North American's production team solved the practical challenges of fuel capacity and mass production. But Thomas Hitchcock made it happen, fighting through the institutional obstacles that could have delayed or derailed the entire program. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote to the Mustang's development, but as a central element of it. The Mustang succeeded because it was a superb aircraft, but also because someone fought to give it a chance to prove itself. Hitchcock's contribution was strategic vision combined with tactical persistence. He saw what was needed when others didn't. He understood what was possible when others were skeptical, and he made it happen when others were content with slower, more conventional approaches. The final irony is that Hitchcock's death came from the very aircraft he championed. He wasn't killed in combat with enemy fighters, though he desperately wanted to return to combat flying. He wasn't killed by enemy action at all. He died testing a P-51 Mustang, trying to solve problems that might endanger other pilots, accepting risks himself rather than asking subordinates to face them. It was an appropriate end, in a tragic way, for a man who lived his life taking on challenges directly and personally. On April 18, 1944, when Hitchcock's Mustang dove into the ground near Salisbury, the air war over Europe had already turned decisively in the Allies' favour. Mustangs were flying daily missions deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign was achieving its objectives. Everything Hitchcock had predicted and fought for was coming true. But he wouldn't live to see the final victory, wouldn't witness D-Day or the liberation of Europe or the fall of Berlin. He died with the outcome still uncertain, though the trend was clear. In the decades since, as the Mustang's legend has grown and its iconic status has solidified, Hitchcock's name has faded from popular memory. Most people who admire the P-51 have never heard of Thomas Hitchcock Jr. They know about the aircraft's technical specifications, its combat record, its beautiful lines, but not about the man who fought to give it a chance when institutional resistance threatened to consign it to obscurity. This is unfortunate but perhaps inevitable. Technologies tend to be celebrated while the people who championed them are forgotten. But the story of the Mustang is incomplete without understanding Hitchcock's role. The aircraft existed in late 1942 and early 1943. The Merlin engine modification had been proven by the British. The potential was clear to anyone who examined the data, yet the Army Air Force was slow to embrace it, distracted by other programs and skeptical of an aircraft developed outside normal channels. Without Hitchcock's advocacy, the Mustang program might have moved forward eventually, but the timing would have been different. Months of delay would have meant months of additional bomber losses, months of ineffective campaigns, months in which the strategic situation remained stalemated. War is about timing as much as capability. Having the right weapon available when it's needed is what matters, not having it eventually. Hitchcock understood this with the clarity that came from his World War I experience. He had seen how delays and bureaucratic processes could doom good ideas. He had watched men die because the right equipment wasn't available at the right time. When he saw the Mustang's potential in 1942, he understood that making it a priority was urgent. Every month of delay meant hundreds of dead airmen and dozens of lost bombers. So he pushed, pulled, cajoled, and maneuvered. He used every connection and every tool available to him. He bypassed channels that were moving too slowly and found people who could make decisions quickly. Robert Lovett, his World War I flying companion, who had become Under-Secretary of War, was critical. General Arnold, once convinced, moved decisively. But these men needed to be convinced, needed to be presented with the case, in terms they couldn't ignore. That was Hitchcock's contribution, making the case so compellingly that action became inevitable. The P-51 Mustang that resulted from these decisions was, ultimately, an almost perfect weapon for its intended purpose. Fast enough to catch enemy fighters, maneuverable enough to defeat them in combat, tough enough to absorb battle damage, and long-ranged enough to escort bombers anywhere they needed to go. The combination of capabilities was unprecedented and, for a time, unmatched. German fighters were individually competitive with the Mustang in various performance metrics, but none could match its strategic range. Soviet fighters were formidable, but lacked the range for escort missions. Japanese fighters were agile but lightly built and vulnerable to the Mustang's heavy armament. The P-51 occupied a unique niche, perfectly suited for the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. And that campaign, for all its controversy and terrible cost, contributed significantly to Allied victory. Modern historians debate the effectiveness of strategic bombing, questioning whether the resources devoted to it might have been better used elsewhere. These are legitimate questions. The bombing campaign killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and consumed enormous resources, but it also forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense, disrupted industrial production, destroyed irreplaceable infrastructure, and achieved air superiority that made the ground campaign far easier. The Mustang made all of this possible at an acceptable cost in American lives. When Hermann Göring saw Mustangs over Berlin and knew the jig was up, he was acknowledging a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. American fighters over the German capital meant that nowhere in the Reich was safe from air attack. It meant German industry would be systematically destroyed. It meant the Luftwaffe could no longer defend German airspace. All of the German advantages that had made the bomber offensive so costly in 1943, from experienced pilots to interior lines to defensive positions, were now neutralized by the simple fact that American fighters could go anywhere German fighters could go and win the battles when they got there. This was Tommy Hitchcock's achievement, made tangible in the form of silver fighters circling over Berlin. One man, through vision and persistence and the willingness to fight institutional battles, had changed the course of the air war. He had taken an overlooked aircraft and made it central to Allied strategy. He had overcome skepticism and resistance and bureaucratic inertia to make something happen that needed to happen. And then, tragically, he had died trying to make that achievement even better, testing the aircraft to solve problems that might endanger the pilots who flew it. The world is full of good ideas that never happen, of technologies that never fulfill their potential, of solutions that arrive too late to matter. The difference between potential and reality is often a person willing to fight to make something happen. For the P-51 Mustang, Thomas Hitchcock Jr. was that person. The little friends that bomber crews relied on, the silver fighters that dominated the skies over Europe, the aircraft that helped win the war, existed because one engineer, in the broadest sense of that term, made them fly Berlin missions non-stop. That achievement, and the sacrifice that accompanied it, deserves to be remembered as long as the Mustang's legend endures.